Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere warm, loud, slightly sticky, and permanently smelling of patchouli and poor decisions, the 1960s. Specifically, the drugs. Not the take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning kind. Not the sensible kind. The kind that made a generation of perfectly normal American kids convince themselves that staring at a lava lamp for 11 hours was a spiritual breakthrough, that a muddy field in upstate New York was the most important place on earth, and that a man named Charlie was in fact a prophet. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And please, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. A huge and genuinely heartfelt thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You shape this channel more than you know, and I mean that. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. You can find the link in the description if you want to drift off through your headphones, like a proper 1960s mystic, minus the legal risk. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan, pull your blanket up, tuck your feet in, and maybe light something that smells nice. Just nothing that requires a permit. Let's take a moment and really sit with some questions, shall we? Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to drop acid for the first time in 1967 with the Grateful Dead playing 30 feet away? Did the people at Woodstock know they were making history, or were they just trying to find their tent? Was heroin actually considered glamorous at some point, or did that require a very specific amount of self-delusion? Could you have survived a Timothy Leary lecture without developing a headache? What exactly was in the punch at the Merry Pranksters parties, and more importantly, did anyone warn you before you drank it? And if someone handed you a sugar cube in San Francisco in 1966, would you eat it, or would you have the good sense to ask exactly why a grown man is offering you candy on Haight Street at midnight? Congratulations, you've just woken up at 1967. Your hair is longer than it has ever been. Your shoes are somewhere you cannot identify. The music is incredible, the ideology is ambitious, and someone nearby is absolutely, definitely not okay. Welcome to the decade that chemically rewired a generation. Good luck. Before anyone was dropping anything, America was buttoned up so tightly it had trouble breathing. The early 1960s looked immaculate on the surface. Chrome cars, crew cuts, tuna casseroles, and a firm national agreement to not discuss anything uncomfortable at the dinner table. Men wore hats, women wore gloves. Children were seen and not heard. And if you had anxiety, a drinking problem, or a general sense that something about all of this was deeply wrong, you were expected to smile, wave, and get on with it. Picture it. You wake up in 1961. Your alarm clock is a clean, dependable thing that ticks and does not apologize for itself. Your coffee is percolated, black, served in a kitchen that smells of dish soap and conformity. The newspaper on your doorstep tells you the Soviets have launched another satellite, that there are troops in a place called Vietnam, that the economy's fine, that everything is fine, and that you should probably not ask too many questions about why everyone seems mildly terrified underneath their pleasant surface. It is Tuesday. It is always a little bit Tuesday. In early 1960s America, your house is neat. Your lawn is neat. Your feelings about your lawn are, if you're honest, more complex and more turbulent than the general cultural consensus would like them to be. But you mow it anyway because the neighbours are watching and the neighbours are always watching. This is the world you have inherited. Post-war prosperity, genuine and in many ways extraordinary, wrapped in a suffocating insistence that prosperity and happiness are the same thing, and that if you're not happy, the problem is located somewhere inside you and should be managed quietly. The television in your living room is new and miraculous and shows you, on its small grey screen, a world that looks very much like the world you're already living in, which is either reassuring or deeply suspicious depending on what kind of person you are. The kind of person who finds it suspicious is currently 15 years old, listening to something on the radio that their parents do not understand, and beginning to feel a low, persistent vibration in their chest that they cannot yet name, but that will, in approximately 6 years, be expressed loudly and in public. The civil rights movement is already tearing open the careful mythology of American fairness. You have seen the photographs, the fire hoses, the lunch counters, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and if you are white and comfortable in your tuna casserole house, you are being asked by those photographs to make a decision about who you are that your upbringing gave you no tools to make. The Cold War, meanwhile, has placed a specific low-grade terror in the back of every American mind, the kind that manifests as fallout shelter pamphlets in the school gymnasium and a persistent, half-suppressed awareness that all of this, the lawn, the percolator, the neighbours and their watchful eyes, could end on a Tuesday afternoon without warning. So you are living in a culture of extraordinary surface and extraordinary unease, and you're being asked to maintain both simultaneously. And somewhere in the gap between those two things, between what the country looked like and what it felt like from the inside, a generation of young people was quietly accumulating the pressure that would, in approximately 6 years, blow the lid off everything. The drugs did not cause the 1960s. The 1960s caused the drugs. America was not a nation that had been corrupted by dangerous substances. It was a nation that had been simmering under a polished lid for 20 years, and the lid was about to come off. The substances were just what filled the room when it did. Before LSD, before Woodstock, before anyone painted a flower on a Volkswagen van, there was a quieter, grimmier kind of chemical rebellion happening in the coffee houses and cold water apartments of New York and San Francisco. The Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and their various brilliant dissolute companions had already been exploring the outer edges of consciousness a full decade before the hippies arrived. And they were doing it mostly on amphetamines and jazz and a bone-deep refusal to hold a sensible job. Let's set the scene. It is 1951. You're in a 6th-floor apartment in Manhattan that smells of cigarette smoke, old coffee, and the specific desperation of a man who has been awake for 4 days trying to finish a novel. The furniture is minimal. The heating is inconsistent. On the kitchen table there is a typewriter, a pile of paper, and a benzodrine inhaler that has been cracked open and the contents dissolved in coffee because someone discovered that this was possible, and word travels fast in certain circles. You are Jack Kerouac, or someone very much like Jack Kerouac, and you're about to write something that will matter. Benzodrine, an amphetamine, had been available over the counter in nasal inhalers since the 1930s, sold by Smith, Klein, and French for exactly what it said on the label. Congestion relief. It treated your stuffy nose. It also, if you swallowed the contents of the inhaler rather than inhaling them nasally, provided a rushing electric alertness that made sleep seem not just unnecessary but actively offensive. It was the original productivity hack, available at any American pharmacy, and the Beats found it indispensable. The mind accelerated. The associations came faster. The gap between thinking a sentence and writing it narrowed to something almost frictionless, and what came out in that state had an energy and an urgency that normal, rested writing could not replicate. Kerouac claimed he wrote the first draft of On the Road in 3 weeks on a continuous scroll of paper, and while historians have gently complicated this legend, the general shape of it is true enough. The benzodrine was part of the method. Not the whole method. You also needed the road itself, the continent, the characters, the jazz, but the drug was the engine running underneath, keeping the machine awake long enough to capture what it saw. Ginsberg used it, Burroughs used it, and heroin and everything else available in a more comprehensive and considerably more dangerous pharmacological autobiography. The Beats were not romantic about their drug use in the way the hippies would later be. They were not building a new consciousness or healing the planet. They were staying awake long enough to write and paying the physical cost of that with what seems, from here, like remarkable equanimity. What they were doing, philosophically, was more important than the amphetamine itself. They were insisting, at a time when American culture demanded conformity, that consciousness was a legitimate subject of investigation, that the mind's ordinary state was not its only state, and that literature had an obligation to follow experience into its stranger territories, rather than sanitizing it into something manageable. This was the foundation on which the 1960s would build. The hippies had the acid and the music and the ideology and the long hair. The Beats had the argument, and the argument came first. By the time the Summer of Love arrived in 1967, Kerouac was an alcoholic in his mid-40s who thought the hippies were a mess and wanted nothing to do with them. He was not entirely wrong. But they were his children anyway. Here is something the tie-dye mythology of the 1960s tends to leave out. The United States government got to LSD before the hippies did, and they did not use it for peace and love. In the early 1950s, the CIA launched a program so classified, so ethically staggering, and so genuinely hard to believe that it sounds like a conspiracy theory, even after it was confirmed in declassified documents. And yet here we are. Let's be very clear about what Project MKUltra actually was. Beginning in 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles, the program funded research at universities, hospitals and prisons across the United States and Canada into the question of whether psychoactive substances, primarily LSD, but also mescaline, barbiturates, and various other compounds, could be used for interrogation, for mind control, or for the discrediting and incapacitation of political enemies. This was the Cold War, and the CIA was deeply worried that the Soviets had already cracked the code of chemical persuasion. They wanted to crack it first. They were thorough about this. You would not have known it was happening to you. That was the point. Subjects were dosed without their knowledge or consent, psychiatric patients who came to hospital thinking they were receiving standard treatment, prisoners who were told they were participating in studies on other things entirely, military personnel who trusted that what they were being given was routine, soldiers sitting down to a drink with colleagues who had been instructed to dose them. The program ran through at least 80 institutions and involved more than 150 separate research projects. It was, by any civilized standard, a program of systematic assault on the autonomy and bodies of people who had no idea what was being done to them. The most famous individual casualty was Frank Olson, a CIA biological weapons researcher who was dosed with LSD without his knowledge during a work retreat in 1953. In the days that followed, he became increasingly disturbed and distressed. 9 days after being dosed, he fell from a New York hotel window and died. The CIA called it a suicide. His family has for 70 years called it something else. In 1994, his body was exhumed. The forensic evidence suggested he may have been struck before the fall. The case has never been closed. The program produced essentially nothing useful. LSD, it turned out, was far too unpredictable, too personal, and too ungovernable to be deployed as a weapon of reliable manipulation. It made people have experiences. It did not make them tell the truth, or follow commands, or believe what you wanted them to believe. It was not a switch. It was more like opening every window in a house simultaneously and hoping the wind would blow in a useful direction. Sometimes it did. More often it blew furniture around and broke things and left everyone involved confused and frightened. The program was officially shuttered in 1973, and director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all related files. Many were destroyed, some survived. A Freedom of Information request in 1977 recovered enough that the Senate held hearings and the broad outlines of what had happened became public record. What it left behind, alongside the damaged lives of unconsenting subjects, was an enormous irony. The United States government had spent millions of dollars and 2 decades covertly investigating the very substance that the counterculture was simultaneously insisting would bring about world peace. They had both, in their own ways, misunderstood it. The government thought it was a weapon. The counterculture thought it was a sacrament. The drug was, as usual, more complicated than either of them. Let's talk about Albert Hoffman's bicycle, because honestly, the bicycle is doing a lot of narrative work in this story. On the 19th of April 1943, a careful, methodical Swiss chemist at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel climbed onto his bicycle for what should have been an ordinary ride home, and instead experienced something that would eventually reshape the cultural landscape of the 20th century. He had not planned this. That is important. Almost nothing about the history of LSD involves people getting exactly what they planned. 3 days earlier, on the 16th of April, Hoffman had been working in his laboratory, synthesizing compounds derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain, and had a long and complicated medical history, used in controlled doses to stimulate uterine contractions, and causing, in uncontrolled doses, the condition known as ergotism, which produced burning sensations, convulsions, hallucinations, and in historical outbreaks the collective madness of entire villages. Hoffman had been working systematically through the ergot alkaloids, looking for something with circulatory stimulant properties, when he accidentally absorbed a small quantity of lysergic acid diethylamide, his 25th ergot compound, LSD-25, through his fingertips. Probably through his fingertips. He was not entirely sure. What he was sure of was that his afternoon became remarkable in a way that his laboratory notebook struggled to accommodate. He described it as a not unpleasant intoxication, a dreamlike state with heightened perceptions and flowing, colourful images. He went home. He rested. He felt better. He spent 3 days turning this over in his mind with the methodical attention of a man who had built a career on precision, and then he decided he needed to verify it deliberately. He prepared a solution and took what he calculated to be a cautious dose, 250 micrograms. This is, by modern standards, an enormous dose. A threshold experience is generally considered to begin around 25 micrograms. Albert Hoffman, meticulous and careful in all other things, had just taken 10 times that, in a laboratory, alone, in 1943. He knew almost immediately that something significant was happening. He asked his laboratory assistant, a man named Ernst Jörg Bodmer, to accompany him home by bicycle. Wartime restrictions meant no car, and the two of them pedalled through the streets of Basel while the world, as Hoffman later described it, dissolved and reformed around him. Familiar objects distorted, colours intensified. The houses along the street seemed to shift and breathe. He was cycling perfectly well, as his assistant confirmed. He just no longer entirely agreed with the nature of consensus reality. When he arrived home, he lay down and asked his neighbour to bring milk, a folk remedy for poisoning that would have done precisely nothing for LSD, and lay on his sofa watching the ceiling perform. The experience was by turns wonderful and terrifying. He believed at moments that he had lost his mind permanently. He believed, at other moments, that he was experiencing something genuinely extraordinary. Both of these assessments were, from different angles, correct. By the following morning he felt fine, refreshed even, able to see clearly and describe precisely what had happened. He documented everything with the completeness of a man who understood even then that he had found something that was going to matter. He called his creation a very special substance for the human mind. He spent the rest of his very long life. He died in 2008, aged 102, which seems like a strong advertisement for moderate psychedelic use, trying to ensure that what he had made was understood, respected, and used with appropriate care. History did not entirely cooperate. but it was a remarkable bicycle ride. Long before Albert Hoffman's bicycle, long before any government program, long before Timothy Leary set foot in a Harvard lecture hall and began rearranging the furniture of his worldview, indigenous peoples across the Americas had been working with psychoactive plants for thousands of years. Not recreationally, not rebelliously, ceremonially, spiritually, with a depth of cultural context and accumulated knowledge that the 1960s counterculture would borrow heavily from and understand on the whole imperfectly. Peyote is a small, spineless cactus. It grows slowly and with great patience in the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico and the Rio Grande Plain of southern Texas. It contains mescaline, a naturally occurring psychoactive compound, and it has been used in religious and healing ceremonies by indigenous peoples of the region for at least 5,000 years, longer, possibly, than any written record exists to confirm. You do not stumble on peyote use accidentally. You come to it through a tradition, through a teacher, through a ceremonial framework that has been refined across millennia, and you sit with it through the night in a specific community, with specific songs and specific prayers, in a specific relationship to the sacred that you have spent your life being prepared to enter. The experience in this context is not recreational. It is not self-improvement. It is not a journey you take to resolve your anxiety about your career or your relationships, though these things may come up. It is a form of communication with ancestors, with the divine, with the deeper structures of the self and the community, that requires preparation, guidance, and the specific container of ceremony to be what it is intended to be. The Native American Church, founded in the late 19th century, incorporated peyote into its sacramental practice as a fusion of indigenous tradition and Christian elements, a response in part to the brutal suppression of native religion by federal law and missionary activity that had spent generations attempting to eradicate the very traditions that had produced this ceremony. The Church's peyote sacrament was legal under religious freedom protections for much of the 20th century, though this was contested, litigated, and attacked repeatedly. The Supreme Court ruled in 1990 that the Constitution did not protect religious peyote use. Congress restored those protections in 1994. The legal battle over whether indigenous people had the right to practice their own religion was still happening within living memory. When the 1960s counterculture arrived, wide-eyed, hungry for something ancient and authentic, carrying copies of Aldous Huxley, and a sense that Western civilization had failed to provide adequate spiritual nourishment, it found peyote already there. It found an entire living tradition of psychedelic ceremony. And it proceeded to remove the sacrament from its ceremony, its community, its careful framework, and hand it to people who had no prior relationship with it, no preparation, and were mostly just very excited about trying something new. This caused harm, not only to the individuals who took it without preparation, but to the communities and traditions it was taken from. The 1960s counterculture had a complicated relationship with the concept of asking permission. It is one of the things history has been sorting out ever since. In 1960, a Harvard psychology professor named Timothy Leary ate a handful of psilocybin mushrooms beside a swimming pool in Cuernavaca, Mexico, on vacation, and returned to Cambridge a fundamentally changed man. Changed in the way that tends to make colleagues profoundly nervous, that tends to make department chairs rub their temples, and that tends to result in the kind of faculty meetings nobody looks forward to. Before Mexico, Leary was a respected, if somewhat unconventional, psychologist, a lecturer with genuine academic credentials and a particular interest in personality assessment. After Mexico, he was something else, a man who had experienced what he described as the most profound and revelatory event of his life, in which he had, in the space of a few hours, accessed levels of consciousness and meaning that 20 years of conventional psychological research had not approached. He came back convinced that psilocybin was the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century, which is a thing that is very easy to believe while you're having the experience and slightly harder to defend in a grant committee meeting. Leary was not discouraged by this difficulty. He was, if anything, energized by it. The Harvard psilocybin project began in the autumn of 1960 with genuine scientific ambition and reasonable institutional support. The initial question was straightforward enough. Could psilocybin reliably produce positive personality changes? And if so, could those changes be measured and sustained? The early research included what became known as the Concord Prison Experiment, giving psilocybin to inmates and measuring recidivism rates, and the Good Friday Experiment, in which divinity students were given psilocybin on Good Friday in a chapel and assessed for the depth and authenticity of the mystical experiences that followed. These were not trivial questions. They were the kinds of questions that serious researchers were, in principle, equipped to investigate. The methodology, however, began to drift. Leary's enthusiasm for the substance he was studying was, professionally speaking, a problem. He became a participant in his own experiments. The line between researcher and subject collapsed. Graduate students were dosed, friends were invited. The careful clinical distance that makes psychological research valid and trustworthy began to look like it had wandered off and was not coming back. The experiments that had begun in a university setting were starting to feel, to the university, like something else, something less like science and more like a movement, which is a thing that Harvard was particularly ill-equipped to accommodate. In March of 1963, Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert, who would later, after his own spiritual journey through India, become known as Ram Dass, were dismissed from Harvard. The official reasons involved missing lectures and other procedural matters. The real reason was that the institution had concluded that two of its faculty members had confused the pursuit of knowledge with the pursuit of transcendence, and that this was not a confusion Harvard was prepared to fund. Leary's response to being fired was to conclude that the university system was part of the problem, that the doors of academia were the wrong doors to be pushing on, and that the correct response was to take his work directly to the public. He rented an estate in Millbrook, New York, invited everyone he could think of, and kept going. He had decided he had a more important job now. He was not wrong that it was important. He was somewhat wrong about what it was. By the mid-1960s, Timothy Leary had transformed from a disgraced academic into something considerably more powerful and considerably more dangerous, a prophet. He had, it must be said, a remarkable face for prophecy. Calm, patrician, unhurried, the face of a man who had decided at some fundamental level to stop worrying about what other people thought, which in certain lights looks indistinguishable from enlightenment, and in other lights looks like a very specific kind of recklessness. He was also an extraordinarily effective communicator. He appeared on television with the composure of someone who had thoroughly metabolized the material, which he had. He spoke in clear, elegant sentences about consciousness, about the limitation of ordinary perception, about the possibility that human beings were operating at a fraction of their available capacity, and that this fraction could be expanded deliberately and pharmacologically by anyone willing to try. To a generation of young Americans sitting in their parents' living rooms watching this man on television, feeling the gap between the world they'd been promised and the world they'd been given, this was intoxicating, and that was before anyone had taken anything. His phrase, "turn on, tune in, drop out," was delivered at the Human Being in Golden Gate Park in January of 1967 to a crowd of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people who received it as revelation. It has been misunderstood in the decades since, typically as an instruction to abandon society entirely and lie in a field listening to music. Leary's own explanation was more nuanced. Turn on meant to activate your neural and spiritual equipment, tune in meant to interact harmoniously with the world around you, and drop out meant to detach from involuntary commitments, school, work, social expectations, in favour of self-directed engagement. This is a reasonable philosophical proposition. It is also, if taken literally by large numbers of 19-year-olds who have access to LSD and a genuine grievance with the establishment, a recipe for significant social disruption. Both things were true simultaneously. Leary was fine with this. President Nixon, who was not fine with this, called Leary the most dangerous man in America in 1970. Leary found this enormously gratifying and mentioned it as often as he decently could. He was arrested repeatedly on marijuana charges in 1966 at the Mexican border, on further drug charges in 1970, and sentenced in what can only be described as a demonstration of the full weight of prosecutorial creativity to 30 years. He escaped from the minimum security prison he had been placed in, fled to Algeria with the help of the Weather Underground, spent time in Switzerland, Afghanistan, and various other locations, and was eventually recaptured in Kabul in 1973 and returned to American custody. He was released in 1976, having served a few years total, and proceeded to reinvent himself for each subsequent decade with a fluency that was either admirable or alarming. In the 1980s, he became an enthusiast of personal computing, describing the home computer as the LSD of the 80s. In the 90s, he was fascinated by the internet. He died in 1996, calmly, on camera, having arranged to have his ashes sent to space, which happened in 1997. He was, from beginning to end, committed to the idea that the door he was pointing at was real, and that whoever came through it would find something worth the journey. Whether he was right is a question that each person who considers it has to answer for themselves. Nixon, at least, thought he was pointing at something, while Timothy Leary was holding seminars and carefully maintaining his air of professorial authority. Ken Kesey was doing something considerably less dignified and considerably more fun, or at least more colourful. The degree to which it was fun depended heavily on who was involved and whether they had been informed of what was in the punch. Kesey was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962 to enormous critical and commercial success, a novel about power, institutionalization, and the fine line between madness and sanity that he had written partly while enrolled in a government-funded study on psychoactive drugs at the Menlo Park Veterans Administration Hospital in California. This is worth pausing on. The government, through the same general network of institutions that was running MKUltra, had paid Ken Kesey to take psychedelics and report on his experiences. He had done so, thoroughly, and had then channeled what he found into one of the most important American novels of the 20th century. Nobody had planned this outcome. It is very 1960s of it. By 1964, Kesey had gathered around him a loose, fluid, determinedly chaotic group of friends and fellow experimenters who called themselves the Merry Pranksters. They purchased a 1939 International Harvester school bus, painted it in colours that suggested the painter had never encountered the concept of restraint, mounted a roof platform on top, rigged it with microphones and speakers and a film camera, stocked it with LSD at this point still legal, and named it Further. Then they pointed it east. The destination was nominally the New York World's Fair, and nominally a visit to Timothy Leary's estate at Millbrook. In practice, the destination was the road itself and everything that happened on it. The pranksters filmed constantly, broadcast music through external speakers, handed out substances to anyone interested, and left a trail of bewildered, amused, and occasionally alarmed Americans from California to New York and back. The visit to Leary's Millbrook was, by most accounts, a polite disaster. Leary's operation was hushed and ceremonial and inward, and the pranksters arrived loud and outward, and determined to have an experience whether anyone else wanted them to or not. The two philosophical approaches to psychedelics, the careful and the chaotic, had met, shaken hands awkwardly, and concluded they had different ideas about what the whole thing was for. What the pranksters moved on to back in California was the acid tests, a series of events beginning in 1965 that were specifically designed to provide no controlled setting whatsoever. This was deliberate. Kesey was not interested in Leary's insistence that set and setting were everything, that the right conditions could be curated and managed. Kesey wanted to find out what LSD did when it was turned loose in a room full of people with music and lights, and noise and no instructions. The Grateful Dead provided the music, the room provided the chaos, the LSD provided everything else. Journalist Tom Wolfe documented the whole enterprise in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, which remains one of the finest pieces of American nonfiction ever written about a group of people who were, by any reasonable measure, completely out of their minds. Marijuana arrived in the 1960s carrying more history than most of the people smoking it realized, and a criminal record it had done nothing to deserve. It had been in America since at least the early 20th century, carried north by Mexican immigrants fleeing the upheaval of the Mexican Revolution, flowering through jazz culture and blues culture and the Harlem Renaissance, present in the same rooms where Louis Armstrong played and Billie Holiday sang. These were not, in the imagination of 1930s white America, rooms it was comfortable acknowledging, which tells you quite a lot about why the drug ended up illegal. Let's talk about Harry Anslinger, because Harry Anslinger deserves to be talked about. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointed in 1930, and he ran what can only be described as one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in American history. He testified before Congress that marijuana caused white women to seek relations with black men, that it caused otherwise peaceful people to commit acts of sudden and inexplicable violence, that jazz music was its product and its advertisement, and that it represented a creeping contamination of the American moral fabric. He called it the killer weed. He funded newspapers. He produced a film called Reefer Madness that depicted ordinary teenagers descending into homicide and hallucination after a single cigarette. The Marijuana Tax Act passed in 1937. The spelling was deliberate. Anslinger preferred the Mexican spelling to emphasize the drugs' foreign origins. This is the thing you're carrying by the time the 1960s arrive. Not just a plant. An entire architecture of racial anxiety, moral panic, and legislative hostility constructed by one bureaucrat who needed a reason to keep his bureau funded after alcohol prohibition ended and left him without a portfolio. By the mid-1960s, marijuana had jumped the fence of its original subcultural context and was spreading with remarkable speed through college campuses, through the folk music revival, through the early rock scene, and eventually into the kinds of tidy suburban households that had never previously had a relationship with anything more dangerous than a strong gin and tonic before dinner. The Beatles smoked it, famously introduced to it by Bob Dylan in a New York hotel room in 1964, in a meeting that has achieved almost mythological status in rock music history. Dylan smoked it, performed it, wrote songs about its effects without ever saying so directly in terms that would cause legal problems. Across America, an entire generation discovered that the act of sitting in a circle, passing something around, and genuinely listening to what the other person was saying for the first time was, if not revolutionary, at least considerably more pleasant than most of what was on television. This was not a small thing. This was, for many people, the first experience of a slowed down, more attentive, more connected form of social interaction that they had ever had. That they were achieving it by breaking a federal law was, for most of them, part of the point. 1967. Summer. You're in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, and you are standing in the middle of what feels, in this moment, like the most significant thing that has ever happened. The houses are Victorian and painted in colours that Victorian people would not have endorsed. The street smells of incense and cooking and marijuana and patchouli oil and something underneath it all that might be idealism or might just be the particular smell of a very large number of young people who have not prioritised bathing. The music is coming from everywhere at once, from open windows, from record shops, from the parks, from guitars played on doorsteps by people who are working on something that might become a song. You're 20 years old or thereabouts. You have come here from Ohio or from Texas or from a suburb of Chicago where nothing was happening and the nothing was beginning to feel intolerable. The human being in January had drawn somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people to Golden Gate Park to listen to Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg and the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and to simply be in the same place together under the open sky, in a spirit of deliberate and enthusiastic non-violence, and this had felt important enough that the media had covered it, and the coverage had gone national, and the national coverage had sent a signal to everyone sitting in their Ohio suburb, feeling the particular weight of American conformity, which was, come, something is happening, and you will miss it if you stay. And so they came. Approximately 100,000 young people descended on Haight-Ashbury between June and August of 1967. The Diggers, an anarchist street theatre collective who had been providing free food, free medical care and free housing with a logistical competence that their ideological looseness tended to obscure, were already there, running the free store, cooking food in the park, offering what they called life acting, a theatre of real events rather than performed ones. For a few extraordinary weeks, the neighbourhood functioned as a kind of improvisational city, something that had not been planned, that had no charter or government or budget, but that worked, in the specific impractical way that things work when enough people want them to and have not yet been disappointed. The drugs were everywhere, and they were mostly LSD and marijuana, and in this context they felt not like escapism but like tools. Tools for dissolving the boundaries between people, for questioning the assumptions that American culture had laid down about who you were and what you were supposed to want. Whether they actually dissolved those boundaries or merely created the feeling of dissolved boundaries is a question philosophy and neuroscience are still working on. In the summer of 1967, the distinction seemed less important than it later would. The Grateful Dead lived on Ashbury Street and played free concerts in the park. Janis Joplin was around the corner. Jefferson Airplane rehearsed nearby. And if you had arrived from Ohio feeling like nothing was happening, here was your answer. Something was happening. It was happening right now, and you were in it. It lasted, in its pure form, approximately 6 weeks before the weight of the numbers began, to break it. But for those 6 weeks it was, by most accounts of people who were there, exactly what it looked like from a distance. The acid tests were exactly what they sound like, and yet somehow still more than you're imagining. Let's put you in the room. It is 1965, somewhere in the Bay Area, a rented hall, a private house, occasionally a parking lot, and the moment you walk through the door you understand that this is not a concert, not a party, not a happening in any sense that an arts review publication would be equipped to describe. The lights are wrong. There are too many of them, and they are the wrong colours, and they are moving in ways that suggest whoever rigged them had a specific agenda. The sound is enormous, and it is coming from everywhere simultaneously, not just from the stage, but from speakers placed in corners and above doorways, wrapping the room in something that is less like music and more like weather. On the stage, a band called the Warlocks, they would shortly rename themselves the Grateful Dead, is playing something that began as a song approximately 45 minutes ago, and has since become something else entirely, following a thread that only they can hear, somewhere out past the edge of what is written down. And in the punch bowl near the entrance, assuming anyone has told you about the punch bowl, there is LSD. The acid tests were organised primarily by Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters between 1965 and 66, and their philosophical premise was the precise opposite of Timothy Leary's careful ceremonial approach to psychedelic experience. Leary believed that set and setting were everything, that the mindset you brought to the experience and the environment in which you had it would determine its character entirely, and that both should be curated with care. Kesey believed this was essentially cowardice dressed up as wisdom. He wanted to find out what LSD did when it was turned completely loose. No instructions, no preparation, no controlled environment, just a room full of people and music and colour and noise, and the drug running underneath all of it like a river that everyone was suddenly swimming in, whether they had planned to swim today or not. What the Grateful Dead discovered in this context was something they would spend the next 30 years refining. That music, played in genuine real-time response to the emotional and psychological state of an audience on psychedelics, could do things that composed, rehearsed, setlist music could not. They improvised. Not jazz improvisation within a harmonic framework, though that was part of it. Something broader, something that followed the room, that responded to the energy coming back from the crowd, that stretched and contracted and found its way to places that nobody had pre-approved. Jerry Garcia's guitar went places in those rooms that it could not have found in a rehearsal, because in a rehearsal nobody is altered enough to need what Garcia was offering. The acid tests were also documented. The pranksters filmed constantly, recorded constantly, producing hours of footage that was shown on screens during the events themselves, so that you were simultaneously experiencing something and watching yourself experience it, which is a specific kind of recursive bewilderment that the 1960s found profound and that the 21st century has recreated rather less elegantly through social media. The parallel is not flattering to either era. But the acid tests were the laboratory in which the Grateful Dead's improvisational identity was not just developed but made necessary, because once you have played for a room full of people who are hours into an LSD experience and following you somewhere genuinely unknown, playing a tidy set with an encore becomes not just inadequate, but actively rude. Woodstock was supposed to hold 50,000 people. You know this part. Approximately 400,000 showed up. The organisers, a group of young men in their mid-20s who had secured permits, hired bands, and built a stage in a field in upstate New York with the confidence of people who had never organised anything this large before and had not fully registered that this might matter, discovered on the morning of Friday the 15th of August 1969 that they had a situation on their hands that no amount of prior planning had prepared them for. The roads leading to the site were gridlocked for 20 miles in every direction. People were abandoning their cars and walking. New York State declared the area a disaster zone, which was technically correct and almost entirely beside the point. You are there. You drove from wherever you live, Pittsburgh maybe, or Boston, or a town in Connecticut whose name you're briefly trying to forget, and your car has been stationary for 4 hours on a 2-lane road in the Catskills with the windows down and the radio on, and people walking past you carrying sleeping bags and guitars and expressions of serene certainty that whatever is happening at the end of this road is worth the inconvenience. You eventually abandon the car. You walk the last 6 miles. You arrive at Maxiaska's dairy farm, a man who had rented his land to the promoters for $50,000 and was now standing at the edge of the stage looking out at 500,000 people with the expression of someone who has made a decision he cannot unmake, and you understand immediately that the number of people here exceeds any framework you have for thinking about numbers of people. There is no fencing. The fencing came down on the first day, when the sheer weight of arrivals made it clear that collecting tickets was not going to be a viable strategy, and that the promoters had two options: charge everyone and create a riot, or declare it a free festival and create something else. They declared it free. Somewhere in the accounting of that decision is a loss that would eventually reach over $1 million, but also something that cannot be accounted for at all. 32 acts performed over 3 days, in conditions that ranged from sublime to logistically catastrophic. It rained on Saturday night with the specific commitment of rain that has been saving itself up. The field became mud. The mud became infrastructure. People slid in it, danced in it, helped each other out of it, and treated the whole sodden situation with a collective good humour that astonished the journalists who had come expecting disorder, and found instead something that looked, improbably, like a functional community of 500,000 people who had collectively decided to be decent to each other for a weekend. The drugs were everywhere and were taken openly, in full view of the state police who had been deployed to manage the situation, and had concluded that arresting 400,000 people was not a realistic operational goal. Jimi Hendrix played the national anthem on Monday morning to a crowd that had thinned to around 30,000, most of whom were still there because the roads were still gridlocked. What he did to that song, the feedback, the distortion, the controlled chaos of it, sounded like the decade itself being played back at full volume. It was, by any practical measure, a disaster that went right, which is its own kind of miracle. While LSD got the poetry and the album covers and the philosophical framework and the Timothy Leary press conferences, amphetamine got the clenched jaw and the 3-day cleaning spree and the conversation that starts brilliantly and ends somewhere confusing at 4 a.m. Speed ran through the 1960s like a second river, less visible than the psychedelic one, faster and darker, and considerably harder on the cardiovascular system, and present in almost every corner of the decade that the official retrospectives tend to leave out. Let's be clear about what we are talking about. Amphetamine is not a consciousness-expanding drug, in the sense that LSD or psilocybin expand consciousness. It does not dissolve the ego, or produce mystical states, or make a vase of flowers seem unbearably beautiful. What it does is accelerate. It accelerates thought, speech, physical energy, and the subjective sense of time, producing a state in which everything feels urgent and important and possible, and in which sleep seems not just unnecessary, but like an insult to the momentum you have built. This is extremely useful if you need to drive a truck across the country, write a novel, or finish a military operation. It is less useful if you have been doing it for 4 days and are now attempting to have a conversation with another human being. The American military had issued Benzedrine to soldiers in World War II as a matter of standard practice, to keep bomber crews alert on long missions, to keep infantry functioning in extended operations, to maintain the capacity for sustained effort that combat required. The drug came back from the war with the veterans, and the pharmaceutical industry, which had been producing amphetamines legally and profitably throughout the war, saw no compelling reason to stop. By the late 1950s and early 60s, amphetamine prescriptions were being written by American doctors at a rate that suggests either an extraordinary national epidemic of genuine medical conditions requiring stimulant treatment, or a pharmaceutical industry that had found a reliable revenue stream and was not asking too many questions about what it was treating. Diet pills, pep pills, energy tablets. The marketing was creative and the oversight was minimal. In the counterculture, amphetamines occupied the uncomfortable space between the drugs people admitted to taking and the drugs they didn't. Nobody at Haight-Ashbury was putting speed on the poster. The aesthetic of the Summer of Love was slow, expansive, soft around the edges. It was a psychedelic aesthetic, not a stimulant one. But backstage, in the recording studios in the apartments where the music was actually being made at 3 a.m, speed was there. It was there in the East Village punk-adjacent scene that would crystallise in the early 70s. It was there in the darker corners of the Haight, where it mixed badly with the optimism and left people edgy and paranoid, and unable to understand why the peace and love wasn't working for them specifically. The drug the decade didn't talk about was doing some of the decade's heaviest lifting. It always is. Nobody put heroin on the poster. Nobody opened their Woodstock set by dedicating a song to it. Nobody included it in the list of things that were going to bring about a new age of consciousness and human community. And yet heroin was present throughout the 1960s counterculture, moving through the same neighborhoods and the same social circles as the drugs that got the celebrations, leaving behind a quieter and far more permanent kind of damage, the kind that shows up not in newspaper coverage of festivals, but in the obituaries of musicians at 27. The jazz world had already demonstrated with brutal clarity what heroin did over time. Charlie Parker, widely considered the most gifted improvising musician in the history of American music, was addicted to heroin by his mid-teens, and spent much of his adult life in a complicated losing negotiation with the drug that produced some of the most extraordinary music of the 20th century and killed him at 34. Billie Holiday's relationship with heroin was monitored, harassed, and ultimately weaponized by Harry Anslinger's Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which devoted extraordinary resources to arresting and prosecuting her specifically, resources that bore no relationship to any coherent drug enforcement priority, and a great deal of relationship to Anslinger's personal animus toward jazz, black culture, and Holiday's refusal to stop singing Strange Fruit. She died in 1959 under federal guard in a hospital room, with 70 cents in the bank and $750 strapped to her leg. By the mid-1960s, heroin had begun to follow the same pipeline as everything else, arriving in Haight-Ashbury, in the East Village, in the spaces where young people had gathered in search of experience. It arrived partly through the same networks that supplied other drugs, and partly through a specific mechanism that the counterculture's philosophical openness made worse rather than better. The idea that all experiences were worth having, that consciousness in all its forms deserved exploration, that saying no to something was a failure of curiosity. This was a philosophy designed for psychedelics, which are physiologically non-addictive. Applied to heroin, it was catastrophic. Janis Joplin used heroin. So did Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, who drowned in his swimming pool in July of 1969. So did a number of musicians whose deaths before the age of 28 became, eventually, part of a pattern too consistent to look away from. The counterculture, which prided itself on its honesty, on saying the unsayable, on refusing the comfortable lies of mainstream America, was often remarkably evasive about this particular truth. The drugs that were supposed to open doors had, for some people, opened a door that only went one direction. The scene was not good at saying this out loud. The bodies made it harder and harder to avoid. Altamont, December 6, 1969. You need to understand what it was supposed to be before you can understand what it became. The Rolling Stones were finishing their first American tour in 3 years, a tour that had been criticised in the press for its high ticket prices, and in response, or in what was framed as a response, though the actual motivations were more complicated, they announced a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California. It would be the West Coast's answer to Woodstock. It would be proof that the spirit of the Summer of Love was still alive. It would be organised in 4 days. The Grateful Dead were scheduled to play. The Jefferson Airplane was scheduled to play. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were there. The lineup was serious. The planning was not. The site was chosen late and badly. A flat, exposed speedway with poor acoustics and no natural barriers to manage the crowd. The stage was built low to the ground, which meant that the crowd pressed directly against it with no separation, no buffer, no space. And the security, the decision that would define everything, was handled by the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, hired for the sum of $500 worth of beer. which is not a security arrangement so much as an arrangement to have a large number of men who have been drinking at a free concert standing between the stage and 400,000 people. Violence began early and escalated throughout the day. The Jefferson Airplane's Marty Balin was knocked unconscious by an angel while performing. The atmosphere, which should have been celebratory, had the quality of something about to break. The Grateful Dead, who were scheduled to go on before the Stones, arrived at the site, felt what was in the air, and made the decision not to play. Jerry Garcia, who had more experience than most people alive with the relationship between music and altered states and the specific electricity of a crowd, understood that playing into this particular room would make things worse rather than better. They left. It was the right call. The Rolling Stones played anyway. During their set, a young man named Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death in front of the stage. The killing was captured on film by a documentary crew. 4 people died at Altamont that day, and the idea that the decade's chemical and musical optimism was building towards something, that the experiment was working, that the drugs and the music and the gathered community were genuinely producing a better way of being, did not survive the footage. The 1960s ended not at midnight on December 31st, 1969, but in a speedway parking lot in Northern California 4 months earlier on a Sunday afternoon. The Grateful Dead went home and kept playing. They would continue for 25 more years, carrying something forward from that era into the world that followed, proof that what the acid test had found was real, even if Altamont had demonstrated that the context in which you found it mattered enormously. Psilocybin mushrooms have been growing in fields and forests and on the dung of grazing animals for millions of years. With the patience and indifference to human affairs that is fungi's great philosophical contribution to the world, they were there long before anyone noticed what they could do, and they will almost certainly be there long after the question of whether they should be legal has been resolved one way or another. They are not concerned. They are mushrooms. The Western world's formal introduction came in 1957 through an article in Life magazine. Life magazine, the publication your grandmother kept on the coffee table next to the Reader's Digest, written by a banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson. Wasson had travelled to Oaxaca, Mexico in search of what he had heard described as magic mushrooms used in indigenous ceremony, and he had found them. And more specifically, he had found Maria Sabina, a Mazatec curandera, a traditional healer, who agreed to conduct a ceremony that included psilocybin mushrooms and allowed Wasson to participate. The article he published afterward was titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, and it introduced that phrase to the American vocabulary while simultaneously, apparently without any awareness of the irony, inviting every curious Westerner in the country to descend on the small mountain village of Huautla de Jimenez and demand access to a sacred ceremony that had existed in careful community context for centuries. Thousands came. Maria Sabina's village was overwhelmed. The sacred character of the ceremony was, by most accounts, severely damaged by the weight of outsider attention, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the decade as Western seekers found indigenous traditions and stripped them of their context in the name of exploration. Sabina herself said later that after the foreigners came, the mushrooms lost their power. Whether she meant this literally or metaphorically or both, it is a sentence worth sitting with. By the early 1960s, psilocybin had found its way to Timothy Leary's laboratory, where it was synthesized and studied and administered to prisoners and divinity students with results that genuinely interested the scientific community before the methodology collapsed. It then found its way to the Haight, and from there everywhere else. You could find dried mushrooms in certain circumstances in the late 1960s, though the supply was inconsistent and the identification of mushrooms, which species are psilocybin containing and which species will send you to the emergency room, requires a competence that enthusiasm does not substitute for. A number of people discovered this the difficult way. Psilocybin mushrooms are extraordinarily safe in pharmacological terms. The related mushrooms that grow nearby and look similar are sometimes not. The 1960s was, in many respects, a decade that kept discovering the importance of knowing exactly what you were dealing with, usually slightly too late. In 1953, Aldous Huxley took 0.4 of a gram of mescaline in his home in Los Angeles and wrote about it in a book so elegant, so precisely observed, and so inadvertently influential that it is difficult to assess it fairly. The book was called The Doors of Perception, the title borrowed from William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite, and it described, in the careful, literary prose of a man who had spent a career thinking about language and consciousness, what mescaline did to his experience of a vase of flowers, a chair, a pair of grey flannel trousers, and the garden outside his window on a May morning in California. You're in that living room. The mescaline has been in your system for perhaps an hour, and you're sitting across from Huxley, or someone very much like Huxley, composed, attentive, taking notes, and you are trying to describe what is happening to the chair. The chair is a problem. It is no longer simply a chair. It is somehow exactly what a chair is, more completely, more specifically, more saturated with the quality of chairness than any chair you have previously encountered. The grain of the wood is doing something, the shadows are doing something. Everything in the room has acquired a significance that your ordinary perception filters out as unnecessary, and the filter is currently not working, and what is coming through in its absence is not chaos, but something more like a fidelity to the actual texture of the world that your sober mind cannot sustain without being overwhelmed. It is overwhelming. It is also, Huxley is trying to explain with increasingly inadequate words, rather wonderful. His argument, careful, philosophical, built on his reading of Bergson and Broad and the mystical traditions of both East and West, was that the brain was not a generator of consciousness, but a reducing valve, filtering out most of reality to produce the narrow, manageable stream of perception that allows ordinary functioning. Mescaline, he proposed, loosened the valve. What came through in the loosening was not hallucination, not things that weren't there, but a more complete version of things that were always there, stripped of the brain's habitual efficiency. This is a proposition that neuroscience has been arguing about ever since, with increasing sophistication and no clear resolution. Jim Morrison read The Doors of Perception at 17 and named his band after it. A generation of young people read it and drove into the desert, to New Mexico, to Arizona, to the Sonoran landscape where peyote grew, looking for something that Huxley had described with such precision that they were certain they would recognize it when they found it. Some of them did find it, or something like it. Some of them found sunburn and car trouble. Some of them found the inside of a ceremony they had not been invited to and were politely but firmly asked to leave. The book sent them in roughly the right direction. The map it provided was necessarily incomplete. There is a clear before and after in the Beatles catalogue, and once you know it is there, you cannot unhear it. The before is not unimpressive. It contains some of the most technically precise and emotionally immediate popular music of the 20th century. Songs of such structural elegance and melodic inevitability that they sound as if they have always existed, and someone merely had to find them. The after is something else, an expansion into sonic territory so unexpected, so ambitious, and so fully realised that it redefined what a pop record could contain. John Lennon was first introduced to LSD in the spring of 1965, and the circumstances are so specific and so improbable that they merit the detail. He and his wife Cynthia, along with George Harrison and his girlfriend Pattie Boyd, were at a dinner party hosted by their dentist, a man named John Riley. At the end of the evening, Riley informed his guests that he had put LSD in their coffee. This was not a request. This was not accompanied by any briefing on what to expect, what the dose was, or how long it would last. Their dentist had simply dosed them without consent, apparently under the impression that this was a hospitable thing to do. It was, by any standard, a remarkable violation. It was also, in the specific pharmacological lottery of such things, the beginning of something. Lennon described the experience as terrifying and revelatory simultaneously, which is more or less the standard report for an unsolicited high-dose LSD experience. He and Harrison both went on to take it again, deliberately, and to find in subsequent experiences something worth pursuing. McCartney held out until 1966, and then took it and described it as a confirmation of things he had already suspected about the nature of consciousness. Ringo Starr took it and reportedly found it less revelatory, which is either a comment on individual neurological variation or evidence that Ringo Starr was, at some fundamental level, more grounded than the others. What happened to the music between 1965 and 1967 is audible and astonishing. Rubber Soul became Revolver, became Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, each record opening the space of what was possible a little wider, each one stranger and more fully realized than the last. Backwards tape loops, Indian classical instruments, song structures that did not resolve in expected ways, lyrics that were not about girls or holding hands, but about tangerine trees and marmalade skies, and the newspaper story of a lucky man who made the grade. Whether you needed LSD to make these records is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that the people who made them had been somewhere their earlier work had not been, and the records are the evidence of what they found there. By the autumn of 1967, something was already wrong in Haight-Ashbury, and the people who had been there from the beginning could feel it in the specific way that you feel a party go wrong, not all at once, but in a series of small shifts, a drop in the temperature of the room, a change in the quality of the noise, a growing awareness that the people arriving through the door are not quite the same as the people who were here when it started. The numbers were the first problem. The summer of love had drawn 100,000 people to a neighbourhood with housing, food supplies, medical infrastructure and social support networks designed for a fraction of that. The Diggers, the anarchist street theatre collective who had been providing free food and free housing with an organisational brilliance that their ideological informality tended to disguise, were exhausted in a way that could not be fixed by more volunteers. The free store had been stripped. The crash pads were overcrowded beyond any reasonable definition of the term. The park smelled, by August, of things that parks are not designed to process. The media had arrived in June to document a revolution and had documented it so thoroughly and broadcast the documentation so widely that it had become a spectacle. And spectacles do something specific to the things they cover. They invite an audience, and the audience changes the nature of the event by being there. The people arriving in the Haight in September were different from the people who had arrived in June. They were younger, on average, runaway teenagers from the suburbs, 14 and 15 years old, who had seen the photographs and read the articles and understood that something was happening in San Francisco that was better than wherever they currently were, which in many cases was genuinely true, but who had arrived without the philosophical context, the community connections, or the resources to navigate what they had found. Harder drugs moved in behind them. The amphetamine that had always been present at the edges of the scene moved closer to the centre. Heroin arrived with the quiet efficiency it always brings to places where young people are vulnerable and alone. The dealers who replaced the Diggers were not offering things for free. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic opened in June specifically because the neighbourhood had generated more medical emergencies, bad trips, overdoses, infections, malnutrition than the existing system could handle. Its founder, David Smith, described what he was seeing in terms that his colleagues in academic medicine found difficult to accept, because it did not match the image of the counterculture that the summer's coverage had produced. On October 6, 1967, the diggers held a ceremony they called the Death of the Hippie. They built a coffin, placed in it the symbols of the movement, beads, flowers, a psychedelic poster, and carried it through the streets of the Haight in a mock funeral procession. The gesture was theatrical, as digger gestures always were, but it was not ironic. They meant it. The thing that had existed in the Haight for those few extraordinary months in the spring and early summer, the specific, fragile, genuine thing, was gone. What remained wore its clothes and used its language and lived at its address, but was something different. The dream had not been wrong. It had just been too honest about its own address. There is no comfortable place in this story for Charles Manson, and no way to tell it honestly without him. He arrived in San Francisco in the spring of 1967. The same spring, the same neighborhood, the same convergence of openness and psychedelics, and a community that was actively practicing a kind of unconditional welcome that left it, on occasion, dangerously unprepared for what unconditional welcome actually admits. Manson was 32 years old when he arrived in the Haight, which made him considerably older than most of the people around him, and he had spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated, juvenile detention from the age of 13, a series of federal prison terms for car theft, forgery and pimping, 17 of his first 32 years behind bars. He was not a philosopher, he was not a mystic. He was a man who had learned, in the specific environment of American incarceration, how to read people very quickly and how to give them what they most wanted in exchange for what he most needed from them. He was also, by most accounts of people who encountered him, startlingly good at this, charismatic in the way that certain very damaged and very manipulative people are charismatic, which is to say totally and without apparent effort. He had some skill as a guitarist. He had studied Scientology during one of his prison terms and absorbed from it certain techniques of psychological manipulation without the institutional context that was supposed to contain them. He had also studied Dale Carnegie. What he constructed from these materials was not a philosophy, but a performance of philosophy, a pastiche of the counterculture's language and values, assembled with the precision of someone who had studied them from the outside and understood exactly which registers to hit. He used LSD on his followers deliberately and systematically. He administered it in settings he controlled, remote, isolated, with himself as the only stable reference point, and used the drug's capacity to dissolve ordinary cognitive boundaries to install his own authority in the space the boundaries had occupied. This is the precise inverse of what Leary and Kesey had intended. Where the counterculture hoped psychedelics would free people from inherited authority and open them to their own genuine perception, Manson used them to free people from their own judgment and make them dependent on his. The drug was the same. The container was catastrophically different. The murders of August 9 and 10, 1969, Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger and 3 others on Cielo Drive, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night, were not a product of the counterculture. They were a product of its predation by a man who had learned its language and used it as a weapon. The distinction matters. But it was not a distinction that the American public or the American press was particularly interested in making in the autumn of 1969, when the trial was beginning and Altamont was still to come, and the decade that had promised so much was settling its accounts. While psychedelics were the philosophical centre of the decade's drug culture, the drugs that got the posters and the album art and the Timothy Leary press conferences, the pharmacological landscape of the 1960s was considerably messier than the poster implied. Running underneath the colour and the music and the ideology, quieter and considerably more lethal, was a whole other category of substance that Americans had been taking in enormous quantities since long before the counterculture arrived to complicate things, barbiturates, sedatives, downers, the drugs that did not expand consciousness so much as switch it off, and that killed when they killed, with a gentleness that made the dying look from the outside like sleeping. You have to understand the medicine cabinet of the average American household in the early 1960s to understand how these drugs got everywhere. Barbiturates, a broad class of sedative hypnotic drugs that included Seconal, Nembutal, Amital and phenobarbital, had been in widespread medical use since the early 20th century. By the post-war period, they were being prescribed with a generosity that reflected both genuine medical intention and a pharmaceutical industry that had not yet been required to think too hard about long-term consequences. Anxious? Here are some pills. Trouble sleeping? Here are some pills. Feeling, in some vague and persistent way, that the gap between the life you're living and the life you'd expected is wider than you can comfortably account for. Here, definitely are some pills. The medicine cabinets of suburban America were stocked like small pharmacies, and the line between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was narrow enough that accidents were common and intentions were sometimes ambiguous. Marilyn Monroe died of barbiturate overdose in August of 1962. The exact circumstances, the quantities, the timing, the people present have been disputed and theorized about ever since, but the drugs themselves were not in dispute. They were the drugs her doctors had been prescribing. They were the drugs available in enormous quantities in her home. They were the drugs that the medical and entertainment establishment of the era provided to anxious, overworked, emotionally distressed women without apparent concern for what would happen when those women were also alone and also having a very bad night. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones drowned in his swimming pool in July of 1969. The coroner's report noted barbiturates and alcohol. Jimi Hendrix died in September of 1970 in London of barbiturate intoxication and asphyxiation. Janis Joplin died 2 weeks later of a heroin overdose. Jim Morrison died in Paris in July of 1971, cause officially listed as heart failure, circumstances involving alcohol and possibly heroin. 4 extraordinary musicians, all dead before 28, all in the year between Altamont and the end of 1971. The pattern was not subtle. The decade had been running on chemicals from the beginning, and by the end it was presenting its bill. The barbiturates were not the drugs of the revolution. They were the drugs of what happened when the revolution stopped working, and the person who had believed in it most fervently was left alone at 3 a.m. with a cabinet full of prescriptions and no one to call. LSD was legal in the United States until the 6th of October, 1968. This surprises most people, who assume it must have been illegal from the moment it arrived in the counterculture, who assume that the government, seeing what was happening in the Haight and in the university laboratories, and on the covers of Beatles albums, moved swiftly to shut it down. In fact, for the first 2.5 decades of LSD's existence, it was a legal pharmaceutical compound, manufactured and distributed by Sandoz under the trade name Delicid, available to psychiatrists and researchers who wanted to use it, studied in clinical settings with genuine scientific rigor, and considered by a substantial body of the medical establishment to be one of the most therapeutically promising compounds discovered in the 20th century. Let's be specific about what that research looked like before it was shut down. Between the early 1950s and the mid-1960s, over 1,000 clinical papers were published on the therapeutic applications of LSD. Researchers at Spring Grove Hospital in Maryland were using it to treat alcoholism with results that were, by the standards of what was otherwise available for that condition, remarkable. A controlled trial found that a single high-dose LSD session, combined with psychotherapy, produced abstinence rates that conventional treatment could not approach. Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was sufficiently interested in this research that he advocated for incorporating LSD into AA's treatment approach, a proposal that his board rejected with a firmness that suggests they had not fully processed the optics. LSD was also being studied for end-of-life anxiety, for the specific terror of dying, which turned out to respond to a carefully conducted high-dose session in ways that years of conventional therapy sometimes could not achieve. Patients described losing their fear of death. Patients described feeling, for the first time, genuinely at peace with the end of their lives. The researcher Stanislav Grof produced a body of work in this area that is only now, 50 years later, being replicated and confirmed in clinical trials at major research universities. California criminalized LSD in 1966. The federal government followed with the Drug Abuse Control Amendments of 1966, which restricted it significantly, and then the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which placed it in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs with high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. The effect on research was total and immediate. The studies stopped. The clinical programs closed. The researchers who had spent 15 years building a body of evidence packed up their files and went to do something else. It would take approximately 50 years before clinical trials resumed, and when they did, at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College London, they found much of what the earlier researchers had found. The scheduling had not made anyone safer. It had made the science stop for half a century, and the people who might have benefited from the science went without it. That is what the legal battle over LSD actually cost. It is fashionable, and not entirely wrong, to catalogue the failures of the 1960s drug culture. The casualties are real. The hubris was real. The way the utopian idealism curdled, through Altamont, through Manson, through the heroin that moved into the spaces the optimism had vacated, is real and documented and cannot be waved away by pointing at how good the music was. The 1960s made serious mistakes, and some of those mistakes cost lives, and the people who made them were, for the most part, too young and too certain to see the mistakes coming until they had already arrived. But it would be a different kind of dishonesty to stop there, because the decade's chemical experimenters, the scientists and the mystics, and the musicians and the people who simply ate something at a party and found themselves somewhere unexpected noticed things, real things, that the more careful and sober decades that followed gradually, laboriously confirmed. They noticed that consciousness was not fixed, that the ordinary waking state, the state in which you read the newspaper and drive to work and have the same conversation you had yesterday with the same slight variation, was one state among many, that other states were accessible, that those states were not necessarily inferior to the ordinary one, and that what you found in them was worth examining. This sounds obvious now. In 1960, in mainstream American psychology, it was not obvious at all. The dominant framework was behaviorism, which studied what organisms did and was professionally uninterested in what they experienced. The idea that subjective experience was a legitimate scientific subject was itself a contested proposition. The counterculture did not prove it. You cannot prove it with a festival, but it insisted on it loudly enough and persistently enough that the insistence eventually became impossible to ignore. They noticed that the context in which you took a drug shaped the experience entirely. Leary's set and setting thesis, that mindset and environment determine the character of a psychedelic experience more than the pharmacology did, has been confirmed in every well-designed clinical trial conducted since. Two people taking identical doses of the same compound in different contexts can have experiences so different that they share almost no phenomenological features. This is a finding with enormous implications, not just for psychedelics, but for psychiatry and neuroscience generally, and it was arrived at first not by researchers in controlled settings, but by people at the acid tests and in the ceremonial traditions the counterculture borrowed from. They noticed that the ego's sense of being a separate, bounded self, the narrative of I, the voice in the head that says this is mine and this is me and this is what I think about what is happening, was, under certain chemical conditions, suspendable. That this suspension was sometimes terrifying. That it was, for others, an experience of connection and meaning and relief so profound that it changed the way they related to their lives afterward. This is what the clinical literature now calls the mystical experience, and it is the single best predictor of therapeutic outcome in psychedelic trials. The 1960s did not invent this observation. Every major contemplative tradition had made it in their own language. The counterculture just made it in a very loud way, in public, to a generation that had not been given access to the contemplative traditions and was making do with what was available. The 1970s arrived, and with them a specific quality of morning after that everyone who had been paying attention in the late 60s could feel approaching before it got there. Not a hangover, exactly, something more gradual and more structural than that. The sense of a tide going out and revealing what the tide had been covering, which was, in many cases, the same ground that had been there before the tide came in. The world had not, it turned out, been permanently transformed. The war in Vietnam was still happening. Nixon was in the White House. The price of food was going up. The landlord still wanted the rent. You were in San Francisco in 1972, or in New York, or in a house in Vermont that 4 people had moved to collectively in 1969 with the intention of building a self-sufficient community, and are now discovering, in the patient and thorough way that reality teaches these lessons, that self-sufficiency requires skills that idealism does not automatically provide. The goat is sick again. The relationship between the 2 people who were supposed to be running the garden has become complicated in ways that affect the vegetables. The funding that was supposed to come from selling handmade crafts at the farmers' market has not materialized at the level the original business plan anticipated, insofar as the original business plan could be described as a plan rather than a hope, expressed in a meeting in which everyone was very supportive. The LSD that once felt like a doorway into a larger reality now feels, on the occasions when someone still takes it, like a reminder of a conversation you're no longer sure how to continue. The communes had, for the most part, dissolved, not dramatically, not with a single breaking point, but in the gradual way that things dissolve when they're built on insufficient practical infrastructure and an excess of projected goodwill. Some of them lasted years and produced genuinely interesting social experiments. Most of them lasted 1 winter, which is how long it takes for the difference between wanting to live communally and actually being able to live communally to become clear. The drugs that had felt like tools for building something new began, for many people, to feel like reminders of something that had not quite been built. The acid trips that had been revelatory at 20 became, at 25, harder to integrate, more anxiety-producing, less like opening a door and more like being asked a question you've been avoiding. Heroin, which had been a problem at the edges of the scene, became a catastrophe at its centre. The bodies continued to accumulate, and across America, the generation that had taken LSD in 1967 and believed, with perfect and not unreasonable sincerity, that a new world was being born, was doing something it had not entirely budgeted for. Aging, getting jobs, having children, voting eventually. The counterculture did not die. It metabolized into environmental activism, into feminist politics, into the natural foods movement, into 1,000 smaller channels that are still running today. What it left behind in the process was the specific, fragile belief that the transformation could happen quickly. It turned out the transformation, where it happened at all, was going to take considerably longer than a summer. You're living in a world shaped, in ways both enormous and granular, by what happened in the 1960s. This is not nostalgia, and it is not an argument that the decade was right about everything, because it was not. It is simply a description of the present, if you look at it carefully enough. The organic food in your supermarket, and the yoga studio on your street, and the environmental regulations that govern the air you breathe, and the political movements that have spent 60 years pushing the country toward a more honest accounting of its own history. All of these carry the fingerprints, direct or indirect, of a generation that refused to accept that the world as it was handed to them was the only version available. That refusal was sometimes wise and sometimes reckless, and sometimes both simultaneously, which is the normal condition of any generation trying to change something large. The natural foods movement begins here. The counterculture's rejection of processed industrialized food, the tuna casseroles and the white bread and the television dinners of post-war America produced a wave of cooperatives, health food stores, organic farming collectives, and small-scale producers that became, over the following decades, the multi-billion-dollar natural and organic food industry. The people who started food cooperatives in Berkeley and Vermont in 1969 were not thinking about market share. They were thinking about growing food without pesticides, about knowing where their food came from, about eating as a political and ethical act rather than a consumer transaction. The industry that grew from their gardens and their co-ops became, eventually, Whole Foods and the organic section of every major supermarket chain in the country. The ideology got commercialized, as ideologies do, but the underlying argument that what you eat matters, that the industrial food system has costs that are not reflected in the price, entered the mainstream conversation and stayed there. The environmental movement has roots that precede the 1960s, but it found its political mass in the counterculture's rejection of the industrial worldview. The generation that had taken LSD and looked at a tree and found it inexplicably, unbearably beautiful, that had experienced, however briefly and however pharmacologically induced, a sense of connection to the natural world that their ordinary lives didn't provide, was the generation that showed up in sufficient numbers to pass the Clean Air Act in 1970, the Clean Water Act in 1972, and the Endangered Species Act in 1973. These are not small legislative achievements. They are the legal architecture that has prevented the industrial economy from doing to the American environment what it was on track to do before someone started paying attention. The people who passed them were not all former acid users, but the cultural shift that made environmental protection a political priority rather than an eccentric hobby ran through the same territory as the counterculture. The drug culture specifically left a more complicated legacy, one that is still being negotiated in courtrooms and laboratories and therapy offices and the legislative sessions of states where psychedelics are being decriminalized one ballot measure at a time. It produced the war on drugs. This is important enough to say clearly and to say without hedging. Richard Nixon announced the war on drugs in 1971, and his domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman said the quiet part out loud in a 1994 interview that was not published until 2016. His words were these: "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." This is a direct quote from a man who was in the room where the policy was made. The war on drugs was not a public health program. It was a political weapon, constructed deliberately to target specific communities, and it worked with terrible efficiency for 50 years. The human cost is not abstract. More than 40 million people have been arrested for drug offences in the United States since 1971. Incarceration rates for black Americans on drug charges ran at approximately 4 times the rate for white Americans, despite research consistently showing comparable rates of drug use across racial groups. Families were separated. Communities were hollowed out. The collateral consequences of a drug conviction, ineligibility for student loans, for public housing, for certain employment, functioned as a second sentence that followed people for decades after they had served the first. All of this for activities that the architects of the policy privately acknowledged were not its real targets. That is the long tail of the 1960s that does not appear on the festival posters, and it deserves to be named alongside everything else the decade produced. And yet the same decade also produced, as a kind of slow-burning counter-legacy, the current renaissance in psychedelic research. The clinical trials producing results too significant to dismiss. The growing evidence that these substances, in careful therapeutic settings, can do things that decades of conventional pharmacology have not managed. The 1960s asked the questions. They asked them badly, in public, without adequate safety infrastructure, with a confidence that exceeded the available knowledge. But the questions were real. And 50 years later, working carefully and slowly in the ways the 1960s could not be bothered to, the researchers are finding that the answers are also real. The substances that a generation took in muddy fields and painted buses are being rediscovered as something that might actually work, provided you supply what the decade sometimes forgot to include: the container, the preparation, the human support that makes the difference between a door opening and a fall. The counterculture planted the seed. History, taking its time as history always does, is now growing what the seed contained. Not every psychedelic experience in the 1960s was a golden afternoon of expanded consciousness and warm universal connection. Not every trip was the Beatles discovering India or a divinity student finding God in a chapel on Good Friday. Some of them were absolutely cosmically terrible. And the counterculture's relative silence on this subject, its cheerful insistence that a bad trip was simply a learning experience you hadn't reframed correctly yet. That fear was just resistance to be moved through. That if it felt dark, you should lean in and trust the process, caused measurable harm to people who needed something more practical than a philosophical reframe delivered by someone who was themselves still high and could not entirely track the conversation. Let's put you in the experience, because the clinical description does not capture what it actually is. You're at a party, or in a house, or in a field that seemed reasonable an hour ago. You have taken something, a tab, a capsule, a quantity of liquid dropped onto your tongue by someone whose confidence you had no particular reason to distrust. The first hour is fine, better than fine, colours brightening, the edges of things softening, a pleasant loosening of the structure that ordinarily organises your experience into the familiar, manageable shape of a Tuesday. You are relaxed, you are curious, you are exactly where you wanted to be, and then something turns. It is not gradual in the way that a mood gradually shifts. It is a drop, a change in the quality of everything simultaneously, as though the floor has changed its angle, and the light has changed its character, and the room has become, without moving, a different room. The thoughts that were flowing freely are now running in loops, returning to the same fixed point with the same intensity, and the fixed point is something you do not want to look at directly but cannot look away from because there is nowhere else in your current field of consciousness to look. The room is wrong. The people in it are doing something with their faces and their voices that you cannot account for within any framework that is currently available to you. And the ordinary cognitive mechanism that would allow you to say this is a drug, this is temporary, this will end, you are safe, the mechanism that depends on a stable, continuous sense of self to operate is precisely what the drug has disrupted. The part of you that would do the reassuring is the part that is currently unavailable. You're 8 hours from a sober state, and 8 hours is not a short time to be somewhere you cannot leave. People have been seriously harmed in bad trips. Some have acted on beliefs produced by the experience, beliefs about their own invulnerability, about the laws of physics, about the nature of the world that resulted in falls, in traffic accidents, in deaths. Some have experienced psychotic breaks that did not resolve when the drug wore off. This psychiatric literature documents cases of prolonged psychosis following high-dose LSD experiences in people with no prior psychiatric history, and a substantially higher rate in people with personal or family histories of psychotic illness, histories that nobody asked about, because there was no intake form, because the drug was handed to them by a friend at a party, and friends at parties do not conduct psychiatric screenings. Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, HPPD, is a condition in which visual disturbances from a psychedelic experience continue, intermittently or permanently, after the drug has left the system. Geometric patterns at the edges of vision, trails behind moving objects, difficulty in low light. For most people who experience it, it is mild and manageable. For some, it is genuinely disabling, an intrusion into ordinary visual perception that does not resolve, and that the medical system, for most of the 50 years during which the drug was illegal, had no protocol for treating because the condition was not supposed to exist. People with HPPD spent decades being told by doctors that what they were experiencing was a psychiatric symptom rather than a neurological one, and being treated accordingly, which is to say, unhelpfully. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic's Calm Down Room was one of the genuine innovations of the era, a harm reduction technology that emerged from the practical recognition that the official medical response to a bad trip, which was to administer tranquilizers and refer the person for psychiatric evaluation, frequently made things worse rather than better. The Calm Down Room was staffed by trained volunteers who would sit with someone through the experience without sedating them, without pathologizing what was happening, providing the human presence and the steady external reality that the person's internal state could not currently supply. It worked. It became the model for the trip-sitter methodology that is now considered standard practice in clinical psychedelic research. The Calm Down Room was built by people who had no formal training, no institutional support, and no budget because the need was immediate and real, and nobody else was meeting it. That is the version of the 1960s that the history books spend less time on. The practical, unglamorous, genuinely useful work of trying to take care of people in a situation that enthusiasm and ideology had created without fully anticipating its consequences. By the late 1960s, the pharmaceutical supply chain of the counterculture had become, to put it as generously as possible, artisanal. The careful laboratory origins of LSD, the Sandoz pharmaceutical manufacturing, the verified dosing, the quality control of a company whose product was used by psychiatrists in clinical settings, and whose reputation depended on its consistency, had been replaced by a network of underground chemists of wildly varying competence, operating in conditions of wildly varying safety, distributing product through a chain that had no testing, no labeling, no quality assurance, and no mechanism for accountability when the product turned out to be something other than what it was sold as. Things went wrong with considerable frequency. The people to whom things went wrong had, in most cases, no way of knowing in advance that things were about to go wrong because the information required to know this was not available to them and had not been volunteered. Let's trace a tab from its origin to your hand, because the journey is instructive. It begins with a chemist, someone who has, through channels that were not yet heavily monitored in the mid-1960s, acquired the precursor chemicals necessary to attempt an LSD synthesis. The quality of what is produced depends entirely on the training and attention of the person doing it, on the purity of the materials, and on whether the multi-step synthesis process was completed correctly at each stage. LSD synthesis is not a simple procedure. It requires specific knowledge, specific equipment, and the kind of careful attention to detail that is not always the first quality one associates with a countercultural underground chemist working in a garage in San Jose. If done incorrectly, the product is either inactive or something that is chemically adjacent to LSD but pharmacologically different in ways that have not been studied and are therefore unknown. The solution is applied to blotter paper, sheets divided into small squares, each square nominally representing a dose. The dose on each square depends on the concentration of the solution and the consistency of its application, both of which introduce further variability. A sheet might be dosed at 25 micrograms per square, which is a threshold dose producing mild effects. It might be dosed at 250 micrograms per square, which is the dose Albert Hoffman took on Bicycle Day and described as overwhelming. It might be inconsistently dosed, with some squares 10 times the strength of others, distributed randomly across the sheet. You have no way of knowing which you have. The person who sold it to you may not know either. The person who sold it to them almost certainly did not test it. By the time it reaches your hand, it has passed through several transactions, each of which added uncertainty and removed accountability. And what was sold as LSD might not be LSD at all. PCP, phencyclidine, an anesthetic developed for surgical use and abandoned because of its tendency to produce prolonged and disturbing dissociative states in patients, was found in substances sold as LSD throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The experience of PCP is fundamentally different from the experience of LSD, more disorienting, more physically sedating, more likely to produce states of confusion and dissociation that are frightening rather than expansive. But without chemical analysis, there was no way to distinguish them from the outside. Strychnine was found in samples sold as LSD, added by some chemists who believed, incorrectly, that it intensified the psychedelic effect. In fact, strychnine is a poison that causes muscle spasms, convulsions, and death at sufficient doses, and its presence in a psychedelic compound is not an enhancement by any reasonable definition. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which ran one of the first systematic street drug analysis programs in the country, tested substances brought in by users throughout the late 1960s. Their findings were not reassuring. A significant proportion of what was sold as mescaline in the Haight was not mescaline. Mescaline synthesis is complex and relatively expensive, and the market was largely supplied by LSD cut with other compounds and sold under a more romantic name. A significant proportion of what was sold as LSD contained additional compounds whose identities were not always established. The psychedelic marketplace of the 1960s was not, in the language of contemporary harm reduction, a high-quality supply environment. It was a market in which the buyer had essentially no reliable information about the product they were purchasing, in which the product itself had essentially no reliable consistency, and in which the consequences of the variability could range from a mildly disappointing afternoon to a medical emergency. The decade that prided itself on consciousness and authenticity was, at the level of its basic chemical supply chain, operating in substantial darkness. The irony is almost too large to fit in a single sentence. Almost. The canonical story of the 1960s counterculture has a gender problem that is large enough to be visible from a considerable distance and has been commented on by historians and critics for long enough that you would think the record might have corrected itself by now. It has not, entirely. The names that appear on the marquee, Leary, Kesey, Ginsberg, Hoffman, Kerouac, Alpert, Garcia, are, with very few exceptions, male. The women of the era appear in the standard account primarily as supporting figures. The girlfriend who provided the domestic stability that allowed the man to do the searching, the wife who endured the infidelities and the chaos and the long absences that the spiritual journey seemed to, Require, the muse whose presence inspired the work but whose own interiority was not particularly the subject of interest. The casualty whose death illustrated the dangers in a way that made the story more complete. This is not an accurate account of what actually happened. It is the account that was produced by the people who wrote the memoirs, and the people who wrote the memoirs were predominantly the men. Mary Pinchot Meyer deserves to be at the beginning of this story, and she almost never is. She was a Washington socialite, a painter, a graduate of Vassar, a former wife of Cord Meyer, a senior CIA officer, and a close personal friend of John F. Kennedy. She was also, independently and with genuine intellectual seriousness, investigating LSD. She had come to this investigation through her friendship with Timothy Leary, whom she had met in the early 1960s, and through her own conviction that the drug had something specific and important to offer to people in positions of power, that it could potentially change the way powerful people thought about power, about war, about the structures they were maintaining. She was not naive about this. She understood that she was in rooms where decisions were made that affected millions of lives, and she believed that the drug she had experienced offered something those rooms desperately needed. She reportedly shared LSD with Kennedy. The sessions reportedly took place in Washington. What Kennedy made of them is not recorded. In October of 1964, 11 months after the assassination, Mary Pinchot Meyer was shot and killed while walking on the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. She was shot twice, at close range, in what appeared to be an execution. Her killer was never conclusively identified. A man was arrested, tried, and acquitted. James Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence and a personal friend of Meyer's, was found searching her studio the day after her death. He was reportedly looking for her diary, which she had told a friend to burn if anything happened to her. Whether the diary was found and what it contained are questions whose answers are not in the public record. Mary Pinchot Meyer's story is not in the standard account of the psychedelic era. The reasons for its absence are themselves part of the story. Diane de Prima was writing before the counterculture had a name for itself, publishing poetry and prose in the late 1950s that engaged with consciousness, with the body, with the political and personal dimensions of the altered state, with the same seriousness and the same lack of sentimentality that characterized the best of the male beat writers and received approximately a fraction of their recognition. Her recollections of my life as a woman, published decades later, is one of the most honest accounts of what it was actually like to be a female artist in that world. The intelligence that was taken for granted, the contribution that was absorbed without acknowledgement, the domestic labour that was somehow always hers even in a community that claimed to have dissolved conventional roles. She was also, practically and concretely, one of the most important figures in the underground press and small press publishing movements that gave the counterculture much of its written voice. She printed things that would not otherwise have been printed. She distributed things that would not otherwise have been distributed. She kept the machinery running while certain of her male counterparts were busy being famous for the ideas the machinery was propagating. Ann Shulgin's contribution to the psychedelic renaissance is, in practical terms, at least as important as her husband Alexander's, and it is routinely presented as secondary. Alexander synthesized the compounds, and developed the methodology for how human beings should work with them therapeutically. Her understanding of the relational container, of what needed to be present in the space between a therapist and a patient for a psychedelic experience to be genuinely healing, rather than merely overwhelming, is the foundation on which current clinical practice is built. The MAPS protocols for MDMA-assisted therapy, the Johns Hopkins guidelines for psilocybin sessions, the training programs for psychedelic therapists being developed at institutions around the world, all of these trace their lineage to work that Ann Shulgin helped pioneer in that laboratory in the California hills without a research grant or an institutional affiliation or a press release. She was simply doing the work because the work needed doing. The psychedelic renaissance that is currently producing clinical results that are changing psychiatric medicine would not look the way it looks without her. This is not a minor footnote. It is a central fact, and the degree to which it remains a footnote in the popular account of the era is itself worth examining. Alexander Shulgin was a biochemist with a doctorate from Berkeley, a DEA Schedule I researcher's license, a small home laboratory in the hills of Lafayette, California, that he had built himself, and a philosophical commitment to the proposition that human consciousness was the most interesting subject available to a serious scientist, and that the most direct method of investigating it was to synthesize a compound, calculate a dose, swallow it, and write down what happened. He did this more than 200 times, with more than 200 different compounds, most of which had never existed before he made them. He was systematic about it in the way that distinguished scientists are systematic. Thorough notes, careful dosing, consistent methodology, rigorous attention to the relationship between molecular structure and subjective effect. He was also, by all accounts, a man of genuine warmth and considerable wit, who liked to cook, who enjoyed good wine, who held regular Saturday seminars at his property where researchers, therapists, writers, and curious people of various descriptions gathered to discuss consciousness and chemistry in an atmosphere that one attendee described as the most interesting dinner party that ever lasted a decade. His path to that laboratory ran through an unlikely series of encounters. He had worked as a research chemist for Dow Chemical in the 1960s, where he developed a commercially successful pesticide called Zectron that earned sufficient goodwill with the company to give him unusual freedom in his subsequent research directions. He had his first significant psychedelic experience with mescaline in the early 1960s, not in a counterculture setting, not at a festival or a party, but in a careful, solo, self-administered session that left him convinced that the experience of consciousness he had had in those hours was more real, not less real, than his ordinary state. This conviction that psychedelic states were not distortions of reality but different and in some respects more accurate apprehensions of it would drive everything that followed. He left Dow and set up independently, acquiring his DEA license through a combination of legal knowledge, professional credibility, and what might be described as confident navigation of the regulatory system, the ability to work within the rules in a way that produced outcomes the rules had not necessarily anticipated. His license permitted him to synthesize Schedule I substances for research purposes. He interpreted research purposes broadly, in the way that a scientist who believes the research is important and the regulations are an obstacle to it tends to interpret regulatory language. The DEA, for most of his career, tolerated this. When they eventually raided his laboratory in 1994, following the publication of Pikal and the DEA's belated recognition that the book contained synthesis instructions for dozens of controlled substances, they fined him $25,000 and revoked his license. He was 70 years old. He kept working. The two books he produced with his wife Ann, Pikal in 1991 and Tikal in 1997, are among the most unusual documents in the history of scientific publishing. Each opens with an autobiographical section, the story of Alexander and Ann's meeting, their developing partnership, their shared life in that California laboratory, written in prose that is by turns tender, funny, and precise, in the way that people who have found exactly the right person to work alongside are precise about the details of that finding. The scientific sections that follow are comprehensive, methodical, and entirely unreasonable in their generosity with information. Complete synthesis procedures, dosage ranges, duration and character of subjective effects, and psychological observations, and Shulgin's own notes on what each compound felt like to inhabit. The books are simultaneously a scientific reference, a memoir, a love story, and an open-source manual for the production of psychoactive compounds that the government had decided should not exist. Shulgin's position was straightforward. The information belonged to the world. Restricting it served prohibition rather than safety, and the correct response to a government that classified beneficial substances was to make the knowledge of those substances as widely available as possible. He was not unaware of the consequences of this position. He had simply decided that the consequences of the alternative were worse. His reintroduction of MDMA to the therapeutic community is the part of his legacy that has had the most directly measurable impact on the lives of other people. The compound had been synthesized by Merck in 1914, noted in a patent, and entirely forgotten for 60 years. Shulgin resynthesized it in 1976, recognized in its pharmacological profile something specific and valuable, an openness, a dissolution of defensive structure, a capacity for emotional honesty that did not come with the perceptual disruption of classical psychedelics, and brought it to a therapist named Leo Zeff. Zeff's response was to come out of retirement and spend the rest of his life introducing it to other therapists. Shulgin died in 2014, having lived long enough to see MDMA enter Phase 3 clinical trials for PTSD treatment. He had been right about what he found. That is a rare and significant thing to be able to say. And so, here we are. On the other side of the 1960s, on the other side of the sugar cubes and the painted buses and the mud at Woodstock and the cold, quiet horror of August 1969. On the other side of the governments that dosed people without asking, and the chemists who made things in garages and called it medicine, and the young people who arrived in San Francisco from Ohio with a backpack and a belief that something extraordinary was happening, and found out in various ways and at various speeds that extraordinary and safe are not the same word. On the other side of Timothy Leary's certainty and Ken Kesey's chaos and Albert Hoffman's bicycle and the calm-down room in the Haight and the DEA raid on Alexander Shulgin's garage in the hills of Lafayette. On the other side of all of it, take a breath. You made it through. Think for a moment about what that generation actually carried. They were, most of them, just young. Younger than feels possible when you look at the photographs now. Those faces at Woodstock, half asleep in the mud, grinning at a camera they barely registered. Those faces on the steps of Victorian houses in the Haight, squinting into a California afternoon that felt, for one specific and unrepeatable summer, like the beginning of something. Those faces in the courtroom sketches from the Manson trial, which was where the summer's most dangerous delusion arrived at its accounting. Young people, most of them, barely out of the houses they had grown up in, barely past the point of having been told who they were supposed to become, handed a world that was prosperous and terrified simultaneously, that had survived one war and was fighting another one, that had built the most powerful economy in human history and was using it to napalm villages in Southeast Asia and arrest black Americans for existing in the wrong neighborhood and told to be grateful for the prosperity and not to look too hard at what was underneath it. Some of them were grateful. Some of them looked at the whole arrangement and decided with the specific, irreplaceable confidence of the very young that they could do better, that the doors of perception, opened wide enough, would show them something the previous generation had willfully overlooked, that consciousness, explored honestly and without the filters that upbringing and institution and social expectation had installed, would lead somewhere worth going. That love, stated loudly enough and sincerely enough and with enough flowers involved, was a political program rather than a sentiment. They were not entirely wrong about any of this. They were not entirely right either. That is the condition of every generation that has ever tried to change something large, and it does not disqualify the attempt. They were not wrong that the doors were real. The clinical research that is now producing results that mainstream psychiatry cannot dismiss is built on the same observation that the counterculture made imperfectly in the Haight, that consciousness is not fixed, that the ordinary waking state is one state among many, and that what you find in the other states is sometimes worth the difficulty of getting there. They were not wrong that the previous generation had missed things, important things, structural things, things that needed to be named and challenged and changed, and that are still, 60 years later, being named and challenged and changed, because the work of that kind does not finish in a decade. They were not always right about the method. The lack of safety infrastructure was real. The hubris was real. The harm was real, and it happened to specific people whose names are not in the history books, and who deserved better than what the revolution's enthusiasm provided for them. The casualties of that decade deserve more than a footnote in a cultural retrospective. Not just the famous ones, the musicians whose deaths at 27 became a pattern so consistent it acquired a name, but the ordinary ones. The teenagers who arrived in the Haight in the autumn of 1967 without preparation and left damaged in ways that nobody documented, because nobody was keeping track, and the ideology of the season did not have good language for damage. The people who had bad trips in bad settings with no support and emerged from those hours carrying something that did not resolve. The people for whom the experiment went wrong in quiet private ways that never made it into Tom Wolfe's prose or the pages of Rolling Stone. They were there. The decade produced them alongside everything else it produced. The honest account holds all of it. But here is what is also true, and what is worth carrying into sleep tonight. The questions the 1960s asked have not gone away. They have never gone away, because they are not questions the 1960s invented. The hunger for meaning, for an experience of the world that is more vivid and more honest and more connected than the one that Ordinary Tuesday provides, is as old as human consciousness. It sent people into the desert with peyote 5,000 years before Albert Hoffman got on his bicycle. It built the temples at Eleusis, where the ancient Greeks conducted their mystery ceremonies, the precise contents of which we still do not know, though the evidence increasingly suggests a psychoactive ingredient was involved. It sits underneath every contemplative tradition, every religious practice, every art form that has ever tried to gesture at something larger than the self. The 1960s did not invent that hunger. They expressed it at full volume, in public, in a decade that happened to have both the surplus prosperity to support a generation of seekers and the chemical technology to give those seekers something very specific to seek with. The expression was imperfect. The hunger was real. And you, lying in your bed right now, in your clean room with your reliable walls and your working plumbing and your phone charging quietly on the nightstand, and your absolute certainty that you know what you took this evening and that it was only melatonin, you are the inheritor of all of it. Of the acid tests and the calm-down room, of Timothy Leary's arrogance and Alexander Shulgin's patience, of Maria Sabina's ceremony and the disruption it endured, of the war on drugs and the clinical trials that are slowly, carefully, peer-reviewed paper by peer-reviewed paper, dismantling its pharmacological premises, of Albert Hoffman's bicycle and the afternoon it produced, and the 100 years he lived in the aftermath of it, watching what he had made move through the world. You are also the inheritor of every ordinary person who showed up, who drove from wherever they lived and walked the last miles through gridlock and stood in a muddy field and heard something that sounded, for one weekend, like the world rearranging itself into a better shape. Who was wrong about some things and right about others, and young enough to believe that the difference could be sorted out by morning? Who went home afterward eventually and got jobs and had children and carried something forward from that weekend that is still moving, faintly, through the generations that followed? History is not clean. It never is. The 1960s were loud and contradictory and chemically reckless and philosophically serious and genuinely breakthrough and genuinely costly. And the full account requires holding all of that at once without resolving it into something tidier than it was. The beauty and the damage, The insight and the hubris, the genuine opening of doors that needed opening and the genuine harm of opening them without checking first what was on the other side. But people showed up, carrying more hope than the evidence strictly warranted, as people always do when they are trying to change something they believe needs changing. They asked the questions, they pushed on the doors. Some of those doors opened onto something real. The finding is still happening in laboratories and clinics and the quiet, careful offices of therapists who sit with people through the hardest hours of their lives, guided by knowledge that was planted 60 years ago in that strange, loud, imperfect, irreplaceable decade, and has been growing underground ever since. So, tonight, as the room goes quiet and the thoughts begin to slow and the distance between you and sleep closes to something you can almost touch, spare a quiet thought for them, for the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, for Albert Hoffman on his bicycle, pedalling through Basel while the world became more than he had words for Maria Sabina in her mountains, whose ceremony fed a generation that did not know how to say thank you correctly, for the kid from Ohio who walked 6 miles through gridlock because something was happening and they didn't want to miss it. They were trying to find something real. Some of them found it. All of them were looking. And the looking, stubborn, flawed, hopeful, and very loud is what moves the world forward, one generation at a time, one open door at a time. Sleep well.